guys, it's Dre2584. On June 13th, 2023, I posted a video on YouTube with the title, My 7 Struggles with Autism. In that video, I talk about the different ways in which things have been harder for me throughout my life than that of the average person due to my autism. The things in that video were rather easy to understand, but in this video, I'll be talking about things that are a bit more complicated. Autism is a neurological disorder, and people diagnosed with it oftentimes have ways in which their brain works that people might find unusual. I noticed before that I had difficulty with things which I found to be strange, and therefore I didn't really know how to explain them. This year, while I was explaining them to my therapist, he taught me that it was due to neurological connections that my brain developed due to my neurological disorder. This helped me to understand it better when I learned that fact. In this video, I will explain some of the more interesting ways in which my autism has caused things to connect together in my brain. For those of you who don't know, I have a series of stories where I talk about myself known as the Bios of Dre. On August 1st, 2023, I released my 7th document with the title Thinking Too Much, which discusses about all the different ways I make myself anxious by getting in my head. Throughout the document, especially in the 6th paragraph, I talked about some of my neurological connections that I'll be discussing here. The first thing I'd like to talk about in this video is something that started to become hard for me in 2019. In some of the videos on my channel, including part 3 of my 7 Struggles with Autism video, I talked about how my autism has caused me to be sensitive to hearing people use swear words, especially when they drop the F-bomb. I unfortunately planted a seed in my head in 2014 that I should get upset whenever I hear it because it's a bad word. And the seed grew over time. In 2019, I started to have this complicated neurological connection in my head relating to my struggle with hearing and seeing people use profanity. My brain started having some sort of connection to it with other things such as words, music, and dates on the calendar. And there's a little bit of history behind it. In April 2019, when I was using this website known as the Top 10s, I made a list that involved me contrasting heaven and an evil place that's often used as an expletive. And many people consider it to be profanity because of that. Hopefully you all know what I'm talking about. I felt a little funny about how I kept writing the word out because even though I was only talking about the place, when I was even younger, I thought it was considered a profane word regardless of whether it was being used as an expletive or to refer to the underworld. The thing that was right after I made that list, I heard a family member shouting a lot of F-bombs that night from the basement, and that caused me the awkward feeling associated with how I kept hearing strong language after using a word I felt funny using, even though I wasn't using it in a bad way. Over time, I had the same kind of feeling with hearing foul language if I used a substitute for a swear word, like fudge or shoot, for example. And I guess it has to do with how I'm implying a stronger expletive if I say a word like that. It got more interesting when I started having a feeling like this with a few other types of words. For one example of a type of word that I'd get the awkward feeling of hearing someone swear afterward if I used those ones would be if I used a more formal word instead of a more common one to describe something. For example, if I said something was fairly good instead of pretty good, that would occur. I feel like it had to do with how swear words are regarded as very informal, and it would act as some kind of neurological repellent. In 2020, that was when I started having a connection like this related to music. One day, I was using that website I mentioned earlier known as the Top 10s, and I made a list on my profile page of my favorite bands and my favorite song from each band I had listed. Then the next few days, I got unlucky with hearing a lot of F-bombs in all different directions. If I were to guess, I would say that making that list had some sort of effect on it because I felt good about the list I made, and hearing things I don't like can extinguish any good feeling I have. Unfortunately, this planted another seed in my head. It became a thing where I would be worried about hearing foul language shortly after doing any project contributing to music on that website. And I would literally be more affected by it due to the fact that it happened shortly after. And I would feel unlucky that it had to be around that time of all times. Similarly, this connection applied to hearing the music of certain music artists in general, even if I didn't hear them by choice. This mostly applies to if I was hearing a woman sing who I thought was attractive and/or has a nice voice. I feel like I couldn't put their music on even if I liked their music because of that problem. Speaking of attractive females, you know how it's hard for some males to compliment a female about them being pretty? In my case, I felt pressured to even tell someone about one being pretty, even if they were nowhere around. Especially because I would have that same problem about being especially affected by foul language after saying that about a girl. It was most likely because that sort of awkward feeling attached to saying that would increase my sensitivity to hearing that kind of language. Even if I just thought in my head that a girl was pretty, I would have that issue. Now let's talk about how this whole connection goes with dates on the calendar. For this one in particular I'm going to discuss, it not only applies to my sensitivity to foul language, but it also applies to the other major trigger I've always had, which is screaming and crying kids. My brain slowly developed a connection over time in which if I ran into either of those things on a specific date and day of the week, I would be bothered by it to a greater extent due to the fact that I'm thinking about what specific date it is. I felt this way the most if it was the 15th on a Wednesday in any month. This may sound peculiar, but this came from when I was little and I had some kind of foot infection on a Wednesday. And a couple years later, something happened that severely upset me on a Wednesday. I'm honestly not sure why it's more on the 15th than any other day of the month. It's just some kind of connection I have with that date. This problem became worse after having a bad day on both Wednesday, February 15th, 2017, and Wednesday, September 15th, 2021. The former was caused by a kid screaming, and the latter was caused by someone swearing. On the latter day, I was actually thinking about what date it was while the incident was occurring, and that made me feel even more agitated. For 4 years, I was keeping all this bottled up in my head because I didn't know how to explain it to anyone. But in late June 2023, I sent my mother a long text message about the connection I had attached to words, music, and dates. Then I gave her more information about it in person the next 2 days. I had that thing a little bit with a few other things, but it was mostly those three. Fortunately, sharing all this with my mother helped my struggle with all this to start going away as soon as I did that. Now it's not as much of a problem. The less I have this neurological problem, the more freedom I feel like I have. Now when it comes to music, I have another neurological thing with it that's a little different from the one I mentioned earlier. It's that some songs or parts of songs will bring up an unpleasant memory I had when I hear them. There weren't many of them, but one example would be the guitar solo in the song Nothing Else Matters by Metallica, which brought up the bad memory I had of a day I mentioned in this video earlier, which was September 15th, 2021. There's even a song from a video game that has a connotation like that for me, except it's a little different. I developed an enjoyment for playing the classic Sonic the Hedgehog games when I was 11, and I developed some neurological connection a couple years later with the theme song from the fourth zone in the second Sonic game. One neurological connection I have that's simple and easy to understand is how if I see something happen that would likely make someone lose their composure by getting upset or excited, it makes me worry about how they'll react. And that song from Sonic describes that situation for me. There were also a few parts from things I watched, such as videos on YouTube, that would bring up something like that for me. When I talked about anxiety and overthinking in my 7 Struggles with Autism video, I brought up at one point that sometimes I feel like I jinxed something. For example, if I would think in my head, I'm glad this baby hasn't cried yet, or this person doesn't curse much, I feel like it'll happen immediately after I thought it. In other words, I would get superstitious. Another example would be if I'm happy about anything happening, I have felt like someone will do something that triggers me right after I had that happy thought, and it'll bring down my mood. There was one incident that happened when I was on vacation at the beginning of it that brought that connection to life. There may have been a few other ways I had superstitions like that, but I went over what came to mind. Now let's get to another neurological connection, and this one is food related. In my video, My 7 Struggles with Autism, I discussed how I became an extremely picky eater when I was little, and I was scared to try anything new. I then mentioned that when I was doing better with it, I still had a fear of certain vegetables, and this was because I refused to try them. The good thing is that I like them now that I'm older, as long as they are made correctly, but I still have a neurological issue with them. The thing is that even though I can eat pretty much all vegetables now, the feeling of fear that I had attached to them in the past causes me to feel pressured into eating them by choice. This caused me to have a bad problem one day last year. If you've seen my video, my favorite and least favorite day from all the different months in 2023, I brought up that my worst day of June 2023 was the 6th, because I got overwhelmed with something in a steak restaurant, but I didn't specifically say what it was in the video. What happened was that I was thinking about ordering a certain vegetable with my food that happened to be the one I was the most afraid of years before that. The problem I had was that I felt too much pressure into suggesting it because I used to be afraid of it, and I still had that neurological connection despite the fact that I didn't have a problem with actually eating it anymore. That's what caused me to panic, and I had to leave the restaurant with my grandmother and my aunt. We went to my mom's workplace afterward so she could help to calm me down, and that night I explained everything I was going through to her through text. Here's another neurological thing I have that I'd like to discuss. It was in 2019 when I was 13 and a half when I really started to feel attracted to females. This school year, it was hard on me because I started feeling attracted to females more strongly, and it caused me trouble in some neurological ways. There were several of them, but I'm going to bring up just one. There was 1 week this year that I had a very difficult time because of something I'm going to bring up. There's this one thing where if a young female does it, especially if it looks nice, the neurons in my head work in a way in which it becomes an obsession. And it has to do with some kind of childhood association I have with it. I'd rather not go into how it caused me to have trouble 1 week earlier this year, but it mentally tortured me. I'd also rather keep it anonymous on what the thing is that attracts me, the way where my brain perceives it like that, because I don't want to be too descriptive on it. That Saturday night when I was having a bad week that had to do with it, I texted my stepfather about everything in depth, and it was helpful for me to do that. Now, for this last one, I'm going to discuss more of a general neurological connection that will help any of you to understand what a neurological connection really is, for any of you who haven't fully grasped it yet. When I was a young child, there were a lot of things that people would do that would trigger me. The first time I got triggered by a certain thing, the neurons in my brain connected that trigger to the feeling, and it kept connecting until I would immediately get upset every time I dealt with whatever thing would bother me. And the neurons connected so many times that it was hard to fix it. And due to my autism, the neurons in my brain made connections in atypical patterns. I learned all of this from talking to my therapist this year. He also told me that the point of getting rid of a neurological connection is to try connecting neurons the other direction, which is to try not to let a certain thing bother you. In conclusion, I'm glad I was able to eventually get all the stuff I mentioned in this video across to people I trust at some time or another. Since 2 years ago, I was fine with sharing the simpler stuff I struggled with to some people, but I thought I would never be willing to share my atypical brain connections back then. If any of you still don't fully understand certain things I brought up, I get that, because some of it was difficult for me to describe when I first explained it. I hope you all enjoyed this video and found it to be helpful. Bye everyone.